The Queen Victoria Building, commonly known as the QVB, was built in 1898 and designed by the architect George McRae. This building replaced the Sydney's markets and started developing during a severe recession period. If you look at the QVB, it's quite an interesting piece of structure, as it's unlike most modernistic buildings that surround our city right now. Also, the position of where the building is located is quite odd, as it's in the middle of nowhere, placed right next to Town Hall Station, and it's considered a whole city block. Pack what the architect's intention and ultimate vision was when building this structure. Initially, this building was made to be a concert hall, coffee shop, office, showroom, warehouse for a wide variety of tradespeople such as tailors, mercers, hairdressers, and florists, all being accommodated. Later, during the 1930s, it underwent a big remodeling, and the main tenant was the Sydney City Council. Then finally in 1984 and again in 2008, the structure underwent major renovations, thus transforming into the QVB we know now as a modern retail destination. Hence, it came back into the initial character of the building and the architect's initial intention and vision. The process of creating the initial vision of the structure took a cycle of events. Hence, after doing this research, it's interesting to observe some of the data we have gathered from exploring the location in present time in 2024. The data we recorded and gathered in real time by observing people in this space and how they interact with the building. I'm going to go through a couple of questions in light during the process of observation. The main age group that we did initially realize were adults, as the brands that were there were typically high-end and wasn't really low retail price. The first question is, how are people essentially using the space? Are they hanging out, studying, or listening to music, or talking with each other? So the first thing we realize is that the space is actually quite narrow, and each level has a couple of cafes, and the cafes seem to dominate the number of incoming visitors. When I was observing the interactions between people, and if you look at the footages, one thing that stood out was how multiple people in the space seemed to gather together to socialize rather than study or enjoy personal time. And most people were there with another person to grab a coffee and talk, and it was not common to see a laptop in sight. Contrastingly, when I investigated image data using Orange and Instagram, most of the images shown were related to the architecture or images of tourists. Though there was a section of images showing the food people had at cafes or just the images of them enjoying their meals, it was quite contrary to what I saw in real life, as the majority of the people really interacting with the space were inside these cafes and shops. Another factor was that the ratio of people going into these retail stores were much lower than the amount of people going into the cafes and food stores. It seemed like tourists that were there to take pictures of the architecture were also there to shop rather than eat. The data investigations on Orange supported this heavily, as the majority of the images were shots of people with the iconic staircase or the clock or looking down at the levels, and here you can see that just by going through all of these images on the image grid. So what were the type of technologies that were most commonly used in this area? The most commonly used technology were phones. It was nothing really beyond that, and people would either be using it when walking from one way to another, going up the escalator or going inside a store. But most commonly people would be using it when they're sitting down at a cafe. Either if they were with a person or not, they would just be on their phones whilst eating their foods. This question is, are the people that walk by the space there to just walk through it and get to another destination, or are they actually there to be immersed with the environment and the surrounding? Biggest realization from being in this site was that a lot of people here just to walk by from Town Hall Station to get to another destination, because obviously beneath QVB is Town Hall Station. And some were just taking pictures of the architecture, and there was also one person even playing the piano. Overall, despite the changes over time, the QVB continues to fulfill its role as a communal hub, aligning well with the architect's original purpose of creating a space that fosters social interaction and supports various trades.
The statue of Queen Victoria was made by John Hugh in 1908. Made of bronze and situated on the corner of Jewett and George Street, a second statue nearby is of the Queen's favourite pet, a terrier begging above a wishing well. The location of the statue is actually to hide a ventilation shaft for a car park. The fountain also recites a story associated with a blind and deaf children's foundation, of which the statue is bestowed to. The dog speaks. Because of the many good deeds I've done for blind and deaf children, I've been given the power of speech. The incorporation of the statue was only by chance and only implemented in the mid-1980s after being relocated from a yard behind a children's reformatory. The statue itself had been neglected, and as the Queen Victoria building was already undergoing renovations, public art was sought after for the entrance. Although initially an afterthought, by examining social media posts and analysing them on Orange, we can understand how the site is now appreciated as a popular tourist destination and the busiest entrance to enter the QBB, as it is placed adjacent to the light rail and metro. Examining social media posts, there's a common angle used to display the statue, usually head-on at an angle. Through these images analysed, not one displayed the dog statue and none encapsulate the space as a whole. This perspective differs from the reality of the space, as there are commonly buskers or people handing out flyers, along with heavy foot traffic. We observed a number of interesting characteristics in terms of how people interact with the space. Firstly, the donut effect finds people tend to occupy the edges of a plaza before filling the middle. Generally, the capacity along the edge reaches 50 to 75% before filling the middle. This was especially true in the Queen's Square. The Orange analysis showed a lot of photos with the same angle. This coincides with where a lot of people were standing within the square. The image below highlights where the majority of people stood, both near the entrance of the building, under hooded areas like the Hague's chocolate store, or along the outside of the statues. Schooling was also a common occurrence and infers when people are clustered together rather than spread evenly throughout a space. However, when an entertainer or busker was introduced, commonly situated under the barriers where the people were standing, the audience circulation is an interesting phenomenon. So overall, what does this tell us about the space? It's clear that designers wanted to have the statue as a center point to the square while people passed into the building. However, due to a lack of seating within the square, people are often situated at the ledge of the statue. Under the Instagram location, Statue of Queen Victoria, Sydney, majority of posts were of the statue itself or people standing in front of it. We did observe a few influencers taking photos with the statue, however, selfies were more common. Most people in the square are passing through, so there are not many people eating or drinking. Phenomenon such as the one addressed in How We Really Behave in Public Spaces can explain some of the movement patterns we see within the square and how people position themselves at busy and quiet times. When going at night, when the square is its quietest, we observe no loiterers and people merely passing through. People opted to stand closer to the light rail where there was better lighting and more people. Terms like batmosphere or chit-chat mooring are some more examples to explain how people commonly behave in public spaces. Overall, the Orange analysis confirms the statue is the main focus of the square, which was the designer's intentions for the public art they sought to install while the Queen Victoria building was under construction. However, by analysing the space more closely, we gain a wider perspective on how the public uses spaces subconsciously.